Mass shootings are depressingly common in America, but some garner much more attention and publicity than others. And this is true of the terrible incident in Buffalo, New York, in May 2022. This was a sadly predictable development. The media expressed little interest when radical left-wing black nationalists went on killing and shooting sprees in Waukesha and Brooklyn. And this channel, and many other outlets, were clear they would take a different tack if a far-right white nationalist went on a similar spree. That they followed the script was as predictable as sunrise. All the media outlets that downplayed the crimes of Darrell Brooks and Frank James, and who carefully buried any reference to their political affiliation, filled pages with condemnations of Peyton Gendron's crimes and of the terrible danger of white nationalism. Those who make no mention of the far-left affiliation of other lunatics screamed about the far right from the rooftops. And not just the far right, because they tarred moderate conservatives with the same brush. Many media outlets blame the crime on Tucker Carlson of Fox News. But this is a laughable conclusion. Do the journalists at CNN really imagine that teenagers watch Fox News? That they hang on Tucker Carlson's every word? Ludicrous. I doubt most teenagers even know who Tucker Carlson is. They live on the internet. They have zero interest in TV or cable news networks. And it's just another sign of how out of touch mainstream media is, and of how its views are based on idiotic assumptions, rather than any actual appraisal of the evidence. Why didn't CNN and MSNBC think the attack might have been provoked by the hatred they've been directing at white people for years? Particularly the scorn they've been pouring on white men. Isn't it just as likely that their own coverage could have provoked that, as their constant screaming about white privilege and white supremacy may have lurked at the back of the minds of Darrell Brooks and Frank James? After all, James Hodgkinson, who shot 5 Republicans at a baseball match, was open about his admiration for Rachel Maddow. Why has she never accepted responsibility for his murder spree? Why has she never apologised for it? Both sides of the divide have attempted to use this event for political capital. I think that's unseemly, and I'd like to avoid doing the same. Though it's obviously difficult to do that while talking about it. But bear with me, and I'll do my best. The most important thing to do is get to the truth of the shooter's motivations, because those have become the political football being hoofed about by both sides. And helpfully, the killer left a manifesto, so that's the best place to start. You won't find it on Google though. They've gone out of their way to bury it. So a search there will turn up nothing. Because Google aren't interested in the truth, or in giving you the opportunity to freely search or to think for yourself. They're only interested in moulding the narrative to fit their narrow worldview. Because they're the worst, most fascistic company on earth. So if you want to read Peyton's manifesto, you'll need to look elsewhere. As I did. Now, the first thing that's apparent is that this was a racially motivated crime. Gendron is a white nationalist who deliberately targeted black people, though he hates Jews even more, as he makes abundantly clear. But this in itself doesn't make him right-wing, because there's a history of obnoxious racism and xenophobia on the left as well. And as both of those prejudices are based on a hatred of culture and ethnicity, any difference between them's primarily semantics. Karl Marx was a colossal racist. Russian communists hated Ukrainians, Chinese and Germans. Chinese communists hated Russians, Americans and blacks. Cuban communists hated Americans, blacks and homosexuals. Korean communists hated the Japanese and Americans. Vietnamese communists hated Cambodians, and Cambodians hated the Vietnamese, and virtually everyone else. And large swathes of the modern left hate white people, Jews, Americans, and the entire edifice of Western civilization. This channel has also made a number of films which leave the radical left-wing origins of the Nazis in no doubt at all. So a blasé assumption that this crime was right-wing just doesn't fly. And if we dig into the shooter's manifesto, it becomes clear that that just isn't the case at all. For a start, it's apparent that Fox News and Tucker Carlson never entered Gendron's radar at all. He is a child of the internet. His inspiration came not from Fox News, but from 4chan, Reddit, World Truth Videos, Daily Stormer, and dailyarchives.org. But he was mostly inspired by Brenton Tarrant, who live-streamed his attack on a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand. As for his political affiliation, Gendron makes clear that he hates conservatives. He hates corporatism. He dislikes capitalism, and he hates what he calls elites. That doesn't sound terribly right-wing. So how does Gendron identify? Well, he supports socialism, as long as it means worker ownership of the means of production. He describes himself as a radical environmentalist. He was a communist when he was younger, but he now claims that on the political compass, he falls in the mild to moderate authoritarian left. Bizarrely, despite the wall-to-wall coverage this incident got, those rather pertinent facts were omitted from most of the media's coverage. And by hiding that evidence and calling Gendron of the far right, what all of those outlets have done is to brazenly lie about a horrific crime. And that's a crime in itself. But what about that other model of probity and objectivity? Wikipedia. Well, Wikipedia's article calls him a white supremacist and a national socialist. They also claim he voices support for the right-wing Great Replacement theory, something that they put in quotation marks, despite the fact that Gendron never mentions it. But that's a convenient way of linking him with Tucker Carlson, I guess. And indeed, their article uses those lies to directly point the finger at Tucker Carlson and other Republican figures like Elise Stefanik. These are illusions which simply don't exist. Wikipedia is yet again posting speculative lies, disguised as objective analysis. But with Wikipedia, the truly revealing aspect is always what they leave out. And despite dedicating 4 paragraphs to the shooter's manifesto, they never mention his communist past, his inclination towards socialism, his commitment to being an eco-warrior, or his identification with the authoritarian left. And they never mention his hatred of conservatives, capitalism, corporations, or elites. It used to be that the job of journalism was to present the facts as neutrally as possible. But that sure isn't the case now. Google, Wikipedia, CNN, the BBC, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Channel 4 News, and all mainstream news outlets now more usually, as they have flagrantly done in this case, bury the facts. They hide the truth, and then they post outright lies instead. And they do it when the real information is freely available, despite their best efforts to hide it. These media outlets are determined to paint far-right nationalists as an existential threat. And they're right. They are. But so are all the left-wing lunatics who butchered enemies down the years. And so is fundamental Islam. But you'll never hear Joe Biden or CNN denouncing that the way they got on their soapbox over the Buffalo Massacre. They lie in an attempt to divide us, to paint the right as an existential threat. And when those lies provoke carnage, they act surprised, like it's nothing to do with them. Now, I want to make it clear that I'm not placing Gendron on the left, because his manifesto is horribly muddled. Indeed, in a self-penned interview, Gendron responds, "Are you right-wing? Depending on the definition, sure. Are you left-wing? Depending on the definition, sure." The guy was just a nutter. And it really doesn't matter where his political sympathies lie. You get plenty of horrific nutters on the left. And you get plenty of horrific nutters on the right. And you get nutters who are difficult to label. It would be nice if, when they rear their heads, the media on both sides could just condemn them, instead of using them for point scoring and pushing their narrative. Especially if they flagrantly lie, as they've done in this case, and in so many others. If you'd like to support this channel, please like, subscribe, and think about buying my books. They're called The Tyranny of the Left, and they go into topics like this in a much greater detail. They're available on the links below. Please do feel free to pick them up and let me know what you think. Thank you.